It is often suggested that Jesus taught that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the lifetime of his disciples, ushering in the new kingdom of heaven on earth before all of the disciples had died. In fact, there are statements in the Gospels that do sound like Jesus is saying just that. This consideration can obviously cause tension for Christian belief because it implies that Jesus was seriously mistaken about an important claim relating to his ministry. It's of course true that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus acknowledges that he does not know the day or hour of the coming of the Son of Man. But many are uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus would incorrectly predict that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the lifetime of his disciples. In this video, I will offer a couple of theories that suggest that the evidence about this issue is unclear and may even lean in favor of the claim that Jesus did not teach that the coming of the Son of Man would necessarily occur within the lifetime of his disciples, but rather that Jesus left the time of the coming of the Son of Man open. Furthermore, in this video, I will only be focusing on the Gospel of Mark because it's largely considered to be the earliest gospel that we have. So statements found in Matthew or Luke or John are not being considered as they are not as early as Mark's account. So the argument will rest on the claim that if the content used to comprise Mark's gospel did not originally present Jesus as teaching an imminent coming of the Son of Man, then the evidence that Jesus taught such a thing is historically inconclusive. With that being said, I will now start with examining the Olivet Discourse in Mark chapter 13, where most of the content of the debate is derived from. I recommend reading the entire chapter 13 of Mark before watching the rest of this video. I will focus though on the verses that are most relevant to the debate. The chapter opens up with Jesus discussing what will be the sign of the impending destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Jesus seems to imply in verse 14 that the sign of the temple's destruction will be the desolating sacrilege, which most scholars interpret to refer to an idol set up in the Jerusalem temple by the Roman army before the temple was destroyed. So Jesus is saying that when his followers see that the idol has been erected in the temple, that they are to flee from the city. It's clearly evident, though, that Jesus sounds like he's describing the coming of the Son of Man to occur right after or shortly after the temple is destroyed. Then Jesus concludes with saying that this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. So it then sounds like Jesus is saying that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the generation, which would be around 40 years' time. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, which, since it's being predicted to happen within Jesus' ministry, which took place around 30 AD, and a generation is considered around 40 years, that makes sense that the generation would be within 40 years of Jesus' statements. So it makes sense that Jesus is also predicting that the coming of the Son of Man would also be within 40 years of his listeners. Now, one common response is to argue that Jesus was not referring to a literal coming in judgment when he talks about the Son of Man coming in clouds, rather that Jesus was referring to a symbolic judgment upon Israel. Now, this interpretation is possible, but it seems unlikely because the passage is the clearest affirmation of what sounds like the second coming or coming of the Son of Man found in the Gospels, and it sounds very similar to what Paul describes in 1 Thessalonians, which seems to clearly be about Jesus' return on the clouds of heaven. So it's not very plausible that the passage is referring to a figurative or symbolic coming in judgment, but rather is a literal coming in judgment. Yet there are a couple more plausible explanations on hand. The first one is that the Olivet Discourse is not historical in nature, but rather fits into an apocalyptic genre of writing common to the time, which had a notable past figure predict the end of times after making a number of other accurate recent predictions, such as found in the Old Testament book of Daniel. So under this view, there is not an inherent difficulty because Jesus did not deliver the Olivet Discourse at all. Rather, it was written to encourage hope during a time of turmoil for the early Christian church. Now, this theory is certainly plausible, though it probably will not sit well with someone who leans towards thinking that the Olivet Discourse must be historical in nature. Yet, it must still be said that this apocalyptic theory is not in conflict with biblical inspiration or inerrancy, since it would not be a misrepresentation in its content, rather it would simply be a genre of writing, again similar to what's found in the book of Daniel. Furthermore, this theory should not raise the objection that perhaps the entire gospel is not historical in nature then, if the Olivet Discourse is not. Because it's clear from reading Paul's letters that the early church believed that the resurrection and second coming of Christ were literal events. So even if the Olivet Discourse is not historical in nature, it's still historical in purpose, it's still historical in style, and this should not raise further historicity claims about core Christian doctrines and events. However, if the discourse is taken as historical in nature, there is still reason to think it's doubtful that Jesus predicted the coming of the Son of Man to necessarily occur within the lifetime of his disciples. In verses 28 through 31, Jesus indicates that the timing of the predicted events would be fairly obvious to the listeners. It'll be like seeing a fig tree blooming. Once you see the tree is starting to bloom, you know what will happen next. Summer is near. So the analogy is clear. Once the disciples see the desolating sacrilege set up in the temple, they should know that the temple's destruction is near. Yet, within the context of the narrative, it should also be a clear sign then that the coming of the Son of Man is near, because within the narrative, the coming of the Son of Man apparently follows right after the destruction of the temple. But at the end of chapter 13, Jesus says, "But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come." So to me it seems unlikely that Jesus would tell his listeners that the coming of the Son of Man would follow right after the temple is destroyed within approximately 40 years' time, with an impending destruction as obvious as a fig tree indicates that summer is near. To me it seems unlikely that Jesus would tell his listeners that the coming of the Son of Man would follow right after the temple is destroyed, with an impending destruction as obvious as a fig tree indicates summer, but then tell his audience that the day the Son of Man will return is unknown and will be a surprise. For if the coming of the Son of Man would follow the destruction of the temple within 40 years, and that would be obvious like a fig tree indicates summer, then the day of the Son of Man would not be a surprise at all. It too would be as obvious as the fig tree indicates summer is near. So to me, it's plausible that the Olivet Discourse about the destruction of the temple has been combined with the discourse about the coming of the Son of Man, and the two have been interwoven, even though originally they were not, because the author of Mark's Gospel, again, had the hope that the coming of the Son of Man would occur right after the temple was destroyed, because that is what was going on during his time of writing. This editorial decision, though, does not give us reason to think that Jesus actually taught that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within a generation, even though he may have predicted that the temple would be destroyed within a generation. Part of the same discourse, this is not the only place in the Gospels that it can be argued that more than one discourse was likely combined. It's important to keep in mind that the Gospels are not an exact transcript of everything Jesus said in the exact order that he said it. So this combination theory is entirely plausible. With that all being said, I think it's at least plausibly doubtful that Jesus taught that the coming of the Son of Man would necessarily occur within the lifetime of his disciples. Rather, he left it as an open question and said that he did not know. Now, Matthew and Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse take a similar route that Mark's version does, but as most scholars agree, the Gospel of Matthew and Luke use the Gospel of Mark to construct their own narratives, so I don't think the particular details found in them pose any further difficulty for the theories that I have been defending. So I think that both the apocalyptic theory and combination theory serve as plausible undercutting defeaters to the claim that in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus taught that the Son of Man would necessarily come during the disciples' lifetime. There are two other short passages in Mark's Gospel, though, that often get suggested to provide evidence that Jesus taught that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the lifetime of the disciples, and I will examine those now. In Mark chapter 9, verse 1, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." Now, this statement does sound like it could be suggesting that the kingdom of God, as in the new heavens and new earth brought about by the coming of the Son of Man, would occur within the lifetime of some of Jesus' disciples. But, as a number have suggested, the statement could also simply be saying that the kingdom of God has come with power, as in it's already at work within the ministry of Jesus and his disciples, and yet it would increase to an even greater degree than they've already seen. So the verse is ambiguous as it stands, and it doesn't seem to me to be clear evidence that Jesus was teaching that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the lifetime of his disciples. I will note, though, that Matthew's version of the statement found in Matthew 16:28 does seem to present it that way, but again, Matthew's version is likely using Mark's version, so it doesn't affect the argument being made. The final statement that gets argued as giving evidence that Jesus taught that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the lifetime of his disciples, found in Mark, is found in Mark 14, verse 62, when Jesus is speaking at his trial, as he says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Now, this sounds like it could be promising that the coming of the Son of Man would occur within the lifetime of those listening at his trial. However, if the coming of the Son of Man is a universal event that would occur with the final resurrection of the dead, then it would necessarily be the case that everyone would witness it even if they had already died. So this verse seems to me to be compatible with the idea that everybody would witness the coming of the Son of Man necessarily. Overall, the evidence to me is not clear that Jesus taught that his return would necessarily occur within the lifetime of his disciples. The three main passages that get drawn upon from Mark's Gospel are all unclear at best when the context is fully unpacked. This is not to say that everything I've argued for is conclusive or will be persuasive to everybody, but I hope it's at least helpful in approaching this topic. Also, please check out the article by Julian Spriggs that I linked in the description. And if you have questions about how my theories work, please let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.